He vanished in the snow, but his dog never stopped looking. They searched for 3 days. The blizzard had swallowed every trace of Caleb Merrick, a retired soldier no one thought would return. And yet, something didn't sit right with Shadow. The old German shepherd had stood at the edge of the woods, unmoving, eyes locked on the trees, as if he still heard something no one else could. Neighbors tried to coax him back, but Shadow wouldn't budge. Then, on the 4th night, he was gone. What followed was a rescue unlike any other, led not by search teams but by a dog who refused to believe his brother was lost. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about loyalty, loss, and the bond that even death can't sever. The snow had come early that year. Out beyond the thick pine line, the land lay quiet, blanketed in fresh powder. It coated the roof of the cabin in slow, undisturbed silence. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a pale gray ribbon against the steel-colored sky. Inside, Caleb Warren sat at the edge of his bed, boots still on, hands resting on his knees, as if he'd been meaning to rise for hours and simply forgot how. The silence wasn't new. It had become his only companion. The walls of the cabin were lined with worn timber, scuffed in places where furniture had once been moved back when the house had 2 voices, not one. A framed photograph sat tilted on the mantel. A woman with soft eyes and wind-tousled hair smiled at the camera, holding up a hand to block the sun. Hannah. Caleb looked at the photo but didn't reach for it. He rarely did. The coffee in the mug by the wood stove had long gone cold. The stove hissed softly, the logs inside crackling now and then like echoes of something ancient trying to whisper back. Outside, the wind whispered against the window panes, but inside, nothing stirred. Not even memory dared speak too loudly anymore. Caleb's face was carved in deep, unyielding lines, not all from age. His shoulders, broad but sloped now with the quiet exhaustion of someone who'd carried too much for too long, rose and fell in a slow rhythm. He wore an old military field jacket over a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to show the scars, the kind no one ever asked about. There was a knock at the door, 2 short, 1 long, familiar. Caleb stood slowly, his knees crackling in quiet protest. He opened the door without saying a word. On the porch stood Ray Lindstrom, his assigned VA counselor. Young, kind, persistent in a way that made her tolerable. She wore a heavy coat and a blue knit beanie that had begun collecting snowflakes. Her breath came in soft clouds as she gave him a practiced smile. "Still not answering your phone," she said gently, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Caleb grunted. That was about as much of a greeting as she was going to get. She shrugged off her coat, revealing a canvas messenger bag stuffed with pamphlets, a notebook, and a thermos. She poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs, one for her, one she handed him like a ritual. "You look like hell," she said plainly, sitting across from him. "I'm feeling festive," he murmured. Ray gave him a long look before softening her voice. "It's been 3 years, Caleb." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. "I know the winters out here can be rough," she continued, "even for people who aren't carrying what you carry." Caleb stared into his coffee. "I came out here so I didn't have to pretend I'm okay." "No one's asking you to pretend," she said, "but maybe it's time to let something in. Even a little." He didn't respond, so she reached into her bag and slid a small brochure across the table. On the cover was a faded photo of a dog pressing its nose into a man's chest. The title read, "Breakwater Haven Shelter, Healing Through Companionship." "I'm not adopting a damn dog," he said flatly. "You don't have to," Ray replied calmly. "Just visit. Walk around. They say even being around animals can help lower stress, reduce isolation. He pushed the brochure back toward her. I don't do well with things that look at me like they know what I've been through. Maybe that's exactly what you need. The fire popped. Caleb looked over at the window. Snow was falling harder now. He thought about the weeks ahead, about the woods closing in with each colder morning, about Hannah's empty chair, the echo of her laughter that no longer bounced off these walls. She stood, pulling her coat back on. "You don't have to do anything," Ray said at the door. "But sometimes the smallest gesture, it opens a door you didn't even realize had been shut." Caleb didn't walk her out. When the door clicked shut behind her, the cabin fell back into its familiar silence. That night, he stood by the fire longer than usual. The photograph on the mantel caught the flickering light. He traced Hannah's smile with his eyes, then looked away. The next morning, without really knowing why, he put on the good boots, the ones he hadn't worn since the memorial. He pulled the army jacket tight around him, stepped outside, and locked the door behind him, not because he feared being robbed, but because he knew he might come back different. The drive into town was quiet. No music, no talk radio, just the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the murmur of his breath against the cold. He hadn't been to Breakwater in over a year. It looked the same. Sleepy, half-frozen, caught in that in-between season of waiting for winter to fully arrive. He pulled up in front of the shelter. The sign out front had faded with time. Breakwater Haven, Animal Rescue and Rehabilitation. Caleb sat in the truck a full 5 minutes before stepping out. The air bit against his skin, sharp and dry. He jammed his hands into his jacket pockets, took a slow breath, and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than it should have, like he wasn't just crossing pavement, but some unseen threshold that would not let him return unchanged. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew he needed to look. The bell above the door let out a brittle chime as Caleb stepped inside. The warmth hit him first, dry, slightly metallic, with the faint scent of bleach, wet fur, and something deeper, something like loneliness that had soaked into the walls, the kind of loneliness that wagged its tail anyway. The front desk was cluttered with donation jars, flyers, and a coffee cup that had long gone cold. Behind it, a young woman with a ponytail and tired eyes looked up from a clipboard and offered a polite smile. "Hi there," she said. "Looking to adopt?" Caleb shook his head once, curt. "Just looking." She nodded like she'd heard that before. "Take your time." The hallway beyond the desk narrowed into a corridor of chain link and concrete. It was louder here, barking, claws tapping, bodies shifting on cold floors. Some dogs jumped up against the gate as he passed, others wagged furiously, hopeful in that way only dogs can be, still believing someone might choose them. Caleb kept his hands in his jacket pockets, his shoulders drawn tight. He didn't make eye contact. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow that made every movement seem too exposed. He walked slowly, each kennel a mirror he didn't want to look into. A beagle barked sharply, a boxer spun in circles, a lab mix howled as if trying to speak. But Caleb barely flinched. His eyes skimmed the plaques, names, ages, rescue dates, stories reduced to bullet points. He moved like a man watching a world he wasn't part of anymore. As he passed the midpoint of the corridor, a golden retriever pawed at the gate, whining softly. Her name was Sophie, 4 years old. "Good with kids," the sign said. Caleb gave a barely perceptible nod but kept walking. He wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't even sure why he'd come. The noise began to fade as he neared the end of the row. The last few kennels were quieter, more isolated, not out of cruelty, but necessity. These were the hard cases. Dogs too old, too anxious, too broken for casual visitors. It was in the very last cage, half shadowed by a flickering light, that Caleb stopped. The dog inside didn't move. A German shepherd, large and broad-shouldered, lay curled near the back of the kennel. His fur was patchy in places, a dull, grizzled coat that had once been proud but now bore the tired texture of years. One hind leg trembled subtly, as if memory still lived in the muscle. Scars trailed along his flank, faded but unmistakable, not from fights, but from purpose, from service. The dog's ears were low. His head rested against the concrete floor, gaze unfocused, until Caleb stepped closer. Then, like an old machine remembering what it was made for, the shepherd lifted his head. Their eyes met, and in that single, silent second, something shifted. The world, with all its fluorescent buzzing and distant barking, fell into a hush. Caleb froze. The dog stared back, unblinking, not with fear, not even hope, with recognition. The shepherd slowly, stiffly, pushed himself up on all fours. His legs shook with the effort, but he stood. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just watched Caleb the way a soldier watches another across a battlefield years after the guns have fallen silent, not needing names, only the truth that lived in the eyes. Caleb's chest tightened. He didn't know why. He squatted slowly, lowering himself to the dog's level, knees popping as he moved. He looked at the plaque fixed to the gate. Shadow male. Age, approx. 9 years retired K9, search and rescue unit. Not recommended for adoption due to age, injury, and behavioral trauma. The dog took one step forward, then another. His nose reached the chain link close enough to touch. Caleb didn't move. Shadow let out a sound, not quite a whine, not quite a bark, just a low exhale, almost like breath after holding it too long. Behind them, a voice spoke softly. "You're looking at Shadow," said the young woman from the desk, now standing a few feet away. Caleb didn't turn. He nodded once. "He doesn't usually get up," she said gently. "Most people walk past. He doesn't even blink." Caleb's voice was gravel. "He was K9? She nodded. "Retired a few years ago. Injured during a mountain rescue. Tore a tendon. He recovered, but not fully. With his age, they pulled him from the field. No one's wanted him since." Caleb finally looked up. "How long's he been here?" 17 months. That landed like a quiet blow. 17 months of waiting, while the world chose younger dogs. Easier dogs. Unbroken ones. The silence stretched. The woman hesitated before adding, "He's still got good instincts. Just needs someone patient. Someone who gets it." Caleb didn't answer. He stood slowly, dusting snow from his jacket sleeve. His eyes hadn't left Shadow. The dog sat now, ears forward, body still. They were both still. Then, without a word, Caleb turned and walked back toward the front desk. The woman followed, her expression unreadable. He stood in front of the adoption counter for a long moment, then tapped twice on the wood. "I'll take him." She blinked, startled. "Are you sure? He has his challenges." Caleb looked back down the corridor to where Shadow still sat, watching him, waiting. "I'm not looking for easy," Caleb said. And neither, he knew in his gut, was Shadow. The cage made no sound, no scratching, no tail thumping, only the faint click of brittle claws shifting over concrete as the old shepherd shifted his weight. Shadow stood. It wasn't graceful. His hind leg wobbled, the old injury pulling at his stance like a ghost still clinging to muscle and memory. But he stood, because something had changed. Or maybe someone had come close enough for him to remember what it was like to be seen. Caleb didn't move. He was frozen in that space just beyond the gate. Shoulders squared, eyes locked forward, every instinct telling him to retreat, to leave before something inside cracked open. But Shadow had already stepped forward, just 2 slow paces. He sat, straight-backed, but trembling slightly, head tilted, ears uneven. His tail didn't wag, his body didn't beg. He simply waited, not with desperation, but dignity. And Caleb understood that look. It was the look of a soldier who no longer salutes because no one's left to salute back. The quiet between them deepened. The barking down the corridor blurred into a distant wall of noise, like waves crashing against something ancient. Only the air between man and dog remained still. And in that stillness lived a kind of recognition that didn't need language. Caleb squatted again, slower this time. No commands, no calls. He just looked into those tired amber eyes, framed by graying fur and quiet history. And what he saw wasn't just pain, it was memory, service, abandonment, waiting. They were the same, he realized, both built for something that had used them and moved on. Behind him, the young staff member approached. Her voice was soft, but colored with something like awe. "He doesn't usually do that," she whispered. Caleb's eyes didn't leave the dog. "Yeah," he murmured, barely audible. "Me neither." She hesitated beside him, watching the scene unfold like someone intruding on a sacred thing. "You can take your time," she offered gently. "No pressure." But Caleb was already rising. His face gave nothing away, but something in the way he stood, slower than before, like he was leaving part of himself behind in that crouch, betrayed the shift. He turned without a word and walked down the corridor. Shadow didn't bark, didn't cry out. He simply remained seated, ears still forward, head tracking Caleb until he disappeared past the corner. Then, slowly, the old shepherd lowered himself back down, the concrete kissing his side like it always had. But his eyes didn't close. At the front desk, the same woman looked up as Caleb approached. He stopped in front of the counter, silent. She waited, fingers laced together, sensing something fragile moving beneath his stillness. He reached up slowly, pulled off his gloves, and tapped them against the wood once. Then he looked her dead in the eye. "I'll take him." Her eyebrows lifted. "Shadow?" Caleb nodded once. He's not an easy case," she said carefully. "He doesn't like to be touched much. He startles easy. And his back leg—" "I read the sign," she swallowed. "We can set up a trial visit if you're not sure." "I'm sure." The woman looked past him, down the corridor, as if trying to see the invisible tether that had formed in that short span of silence. When she looked back, her voice had softened. "I'll get the paperwork." As she turned, Caleb stood there motionless, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to his sleeves. He could still feel the weight of Shadow's gaze on him, like a thread pulled tight across the hallway, not tugging him forward, but anchoring him to something real. He walked out the shelter door without taking a pamphlet, without asking questions, without even a backward glance. But 10 minutes later he came back, not hurried, not hesitant, just returned. The woman was still behind the desk. She looked up, surprised. Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. The corners were frayed, the stitching faded with time and touch. He placed it gently on the counter, as if the moment required more reverence than a simple transaction. "Where do I sign?" he asked, voice steady but low, the kind of tone that carried weight behind its restraint. Across from him, the young woman behind the desk blinked. She looked down at the adoption papers in front of her, and then at the man. He didn't look like the typical shelter visitor. His boots were still dusted with pine needles. His flannel shirt was lined with wear, but it was the eyes that struck her most. Not because they were tired, but because they'd seen too much, and somehow still held softness beneath the guarded quiet. She handed him the pen. "Right there," she said gently, tapping the line labeled "Adopter's Signature." Caleb took it. His hand hovered for a second. Then, with deliberate care, he signed his name. Caleb Merrick. Behind him, a rustle of clumsy paws echoed in the small lobby. The pup, the same one that had licked his hand just hours ago, let out a yawn big enough to swallow his entire face, then trotted over, tail swishing like an unruly flag. "He's all yours now," the woman said, offering a small, sincere smile. Caleb glanced down. The pup was sitting beside him, leaning into his boot like it was already home. He reached down slowly, fingers brushing over the pup's fur. Warm, real, alive. "You've got big paws to fill," Caleb murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The words weren't a challenge. They were an acknowledgment of what had been and what could be again. He stood, slid the wallet back into his coat, and took the leash gently from the woman's hand. As he turned toward the door, she called out softly, "What's his name?" Caleb paused, looked back over his shoulder. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think I'll let him tell me." Outside, the cold greeted them like an old friend. Snowflakes drifted quietly. The sun cut through the clouds in soft gold lines. Caleb took a breath, one that felt a little deeper than usual. The pup bounded ahead into the snow, legs too big for his coordination. Caleb laughed. The sound cracked the still air like spring breaking through a long winter. And somewhere, beneath the pine tree not far from the lake, the wind stirred the leaves gently, like a whisper. The snow fell in a hush. It wasn't a storm, just the quiet kind, slow, steady flakes drifting like breath from the sky. By the time Caleb pulled off the forest road and up the winding gravel drive, the world had softened under a thin white blanket. Tire tracks crunched through fresh powder, curving around the pine trees until they stopped in front of the cabin. He cut the engine but didn't open the door right away. Beside him in the passenger seat, Shadow sat quietly, the leash looped loosely over Caleb's wrist. The dog hadn't whined once during the 40-minute drive, hadn't barked or shuffled, just sat there watching the road, like he understood the gravity of going somewhere new after 17 months of waiting. Caleb exhaled and opened the door. The cold hit first, crisp and clean, tinged with wood smoke. He stepped out, boots sinking into the snow, then circled around to the passenger side. He opened the door slowly, giving Shadow time. "Come on," he said softly. The dog hesitated. Then, without looking up, he shifted his weight and stepped down from the truck, one paw at a time. His back leg faltered slightly, but he didn't whimper. He never did. Shadow moved with the quiet pride of someone who no longer chased anything, but remembered what it was like to lead. Caleb kept the leash on. He told himself it was for safety. Shadow didn't know the terrain yet. But the truth lay deeper. In the quiet uncertainty neither of them voiced. Trust takes time, and neither of them had much practice anymore. The cabin stood like a sentinel among the trees. Weathered timber, narrow porch, a small stack of firewood leaning against the wall. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin column, trailing into the clouds. Caleb led the way up the steps. Shadow followed, claws ticking faintly against the wood. The door creaked open into a room that smelled of cedar, coffee grounds, and thyme. A cast-iron stove pulsed with low heat. Light filtered through the frosted windows, throwing pale reflections onto the wooden floor. Shadow paused at the threshold. For a moment, Caleb thought he wouldn't enter. Then the dog stepped forward, slow and cautious, head low, ears half-pinned. Not out of fear, but calculation. He sniffed the air, paused to assess the layout, then limped into the cabin like a soldier scanning unfamiliar ground. Every step was deliberate, every room a puzzle to be solved. Caleb stepped aside, giving him space. The leash remained in his hand, but slack. Shadow moved through the cabin, nose tracing old boots, a folded flannel, the edge of the hearth. He paused at the rug by the fire, then limped toward the kitchen, circling the table once. A half-filled bowl of water waited by the wall, next to an empty one for food. "I didn't know what you'd like," Caleb muttered. "So, I guessed." Shadow didn't look back. He sniffed the bowl, then drank, slow and measured. The sound of lapping water was the loudest thing in the house. Caleb removed his jacket, draped it over the back of the nearest chair, and stood there for a long moment, watching the shepherd explore his world. Watching the space shift, subtly, like a room exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The fire crackled once. A log settled deeper into the embers. Shadow wandered into the small den and stopped in front of the old leather armchair, the one Caleb hadn't sat in since Hannah died. It still held the shape of her favorite throw blanket, folded neatly on the cushion. The dog didn't touch it, just stood there, head tilted, eyes resting on the empty space, like he felt the gravity of what once was. Caleb's throat tightened. He turned away, unsure why. After a few minutes, he unhooked the leash. Shadow didn't flinch. He simply walked back toward the fireplace and laid down, curling into himself, chin on his front paws. The silence returned, not as something oppressive this time, but shared. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, two souls, scarred and silent, began the quiet work of occupying the same space without asking for anything more than presence. Caleb sat on the edge of the couch, arms resting on his knees, eyes on the flames. He didn't speak. He didn't move to pet Shadow or call him closer. The dog didn't need that, and neither did he. Not yet. But something had shifted, something real, small, almost invisible, but there, nonetheless, a beginning. The days passed like falling snow, slow, silent, and barely noticeable until you looked up and realized how much had settled. Mornings came early in the cabin, just as they always had. The sun, when it bothered to show at all, climbed slowly through the frost-bitten trees, sending shards of pale light through the slats in the wooden blinds. Caleb would rise without alarm, boots on before the kettle even began to boil. He moved through the house with the same quiet purpose that had once defined him in uniform. Wake, chop wood, feed the stove, walk the perimeter, repeat. There was comfort in simplicity, in knowing what came next. And now there was Shadow. The shepherd didn't sleep in a bed. He chose instead the rug near the hearth, close to the fire, but never too close. Even asleep, he seemed alert, like his body hadn't quite learned how to rest all the way. When Caleb stepped outside in the mornings, Shadow followed to the porch. Not too close, not too far. Just enough. He didn't bark, didn't pace. He simply watched. Eyes tracking Caleb as he moved through the snow, splitting logs with the old axe, stacking the pieces in clean rows like bricks made of silence. It became a pattern. Caleb would chop, Shadow would watch, two broken things in motion, separate, but in rhythm. Some days Caleb would pause and glance back. Shadow would tilt his head, ears flicking in response to distant wind or birdsong, but never moved closer. It wasn't avoidance, it was respect, each giving the other space they hadn't known they needed. Caleb found himself talking less, not because there was no one to speak to, but because words felt unnecessary. There was something steadying about Shadow's presence, the way the dog filled the house without making noise, the way he followed Caleb's pace on walks without a leash, never running ahead, never falling behind. When they walked, it wasn't exercise, it was memory in motion. The trails behind the cabin twisted through pine and aspen, blanketed now in white. Caleb wore his old parka, the one with a tear near the left shoulder. Shadow, with his uneven gait, moved beside him like a shadow that had grown solid again. Their boots and paws left twin lines in the snow. Neither of them needed to speak, because silence, when shared, stops being empty. Even inside, the balance remained. Shadow would lie near the window during the afternoons, his nose twitching slightly at every creak or gust outside. Caleb would sit at the small kitchen table, scribbling notes on yellowing paper, old routines, gear lists, things to fix on the truck come spring. Now and then his eyes would drift over to the shepherd, still and steady as carved stone. Once, Caleb stood near the stove, mug in hand, and watched Shadow sleep. The fire cracked low beside them. He studied the way the dog's legs twitched in sleep, like he was chasing something in dreams. Or maybe, remembering what it was like to run without pain. Caleb didn't speak, but he whispered a thought in his chest. You still remember, don't you? At night, the rhythm continued. Dinner was simple: rice, eggs, boiled chicken when he had it. Caleb would eat at the counter, standing. Shadow, respectful, waited a few paces away until a plate was quietly set on the floor near the hearth. He never rushed to it, just walked over, sat down, and ate like he was still under command. One evening, as the wind howled against the roof, Caleb lit a candle beside the photograph of Hannah. Shadow approached slowly, sat down near the edge of the rug, and stared at the frame. He didn't growl, didn't sniff. He just looked. And for a fleeting second, Caleb felt something move through the room. Something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite peace. Just a presence. A soft, invisible nod from one quiet soul to another. You'd have liked her, Caleb murmured, not even realizing he'd spoken. Shadow blinked, then laid his head down on his paws. Outside, the wind pushed harder against the windows. Inside, the fire held, and for the first time in years, Caleb didn't feel like the only living thing in the house. He glanced at Shadow, chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. We're not there yet, he said quietly. But we're not nowhere either. The dog didn't move, but Caleb didn't need him to. They were both here, and somehow that was already more than either of them had hoped for. The storm came in quietly, like most things in that part of the mountains. Snow pressed against the windows in a slow, insistent hush, blanketing the world in stillness. The fire hissed low in the stove, throwing golden shapes against the log walls. Outside, the pine trees bent ever so slightly under the weight of wind and white. Inside, the cabin felt timeless. Caleb stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his elbows, wiping a plate with an old dish towel. The room was warm, dim. A kettle steamed gently on the stove, filling the air with the faint scent of chamomile. It was a rare kind of evening, one where nothing needed fixing, and the silence wasn't heavy, just present. Shadow lay curled near the hearth, eyes half closed, ears twitching with every small sound the cabin made. He hadn't moved much since dinner. His body was aging, sure, but his presence never diminished. He rested like a watchtower, quiet, observant, always listening, even in stillness. Caleb moved to set the plate on the shelf above the counter. His fingers slipped. The glass hit the edge of the counter, spun once midair, and shattered on the floor with a sound that cut through the cabin like gunfire. Sharp, sudden, familiar. For a split second, Caleb's body tensed the way it had been trained to, breath caught, shoulders locked, eyes wide. The world shrank to the sound. Before he even knew what he was doing, the word left his mouth. "Down!" Command voice. Clean, firm, automatic. It wasn't a shout. Not quite. But it held a tone that didn't ask. It required. And Shadow moved. Not with hesitation. Not slowly. With precision. The shepherd dropped to the floor in a single, clean motion. Head down, front legs out, body flat. No bark, no panic. Just response. Immediate and exact. Like a switch had been flipped inside him. Like the memory of 1,000 past commands had been waiting just beneath the surface, needing only one syllable to surface again. Caleb stared at him. The glass crunched under his boots as he moved around the mess, crouching down slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that even this moment might be too much. Shadow didn't move, didn't look up, but he was aware, waiting for what came next. Waiting for permission, the way only a trained service dog does, still in service, even if the war was over and the uniform long gone. Caleb knelt beside him, the words catching in his throat. "You still remember, huh?" His voice was softer now, not a command, a realization. Shadow lifted his head, eyes locking with Caleb's. They weren't young eyes. They didn't burn with fire, but they didn't need to. There was clarity there, focus, like something long dormant had woken up and found its place again. Caleb reached out slowly, hand hovering near the dog's ear. Shadow didn't flinch. He closed the space gently, fingers brushing the thick fur behind the shepherd's neck. He let his hand rest there. No scratching, no praise, just contact. Quiet and certain. "Yeah," Caleb murmured. "You remember?" And maybe it wasn't just Shadow he was talking to. Maybe it was the part of himself that hadn't given an order in years. The part that forgot what it felt like to be obeyed, not out of fear, but out of bond, trust, duty. He sat on the floor for a long while, his hand still resting lightly on the dog's shoulder. The fire crackled behind them. Wind howled outside. But in that moment, the cabin wasn't just a shelter in the woods. It was a kind of home base again, one built not from bricks or strategy, but from recognition. The quiet, unshakable kind that forms when two lives learn to move again, side by side. When Caleb finally stood, Shadow followed, not with stiffness, but purpose. He walked not like a pet, not like a patient, but like a partner. And Caleb, without even thinking, gave a subtle hand signal as he moved toward the door. It was small, barely noticeable. Just a quiet flick of 2 fingers and a tilt of his wrist. An old habit burned into muscle memory, forged through years of trust and repetition. He didn't mean to do it. It just happened, like breathing. And Shadow followed, perfectly in step. No hesitation, no pause. His movements were slower now, the weight of years resting in his joints, but his response was immediate, precise, as if no time had passed since their last mission, their last patrol, their last unspoken understanding. Caleb paused in the doorway. Outside, the sky was bruised with early evening light, that gentle in-between time when the world softened and things that were too hard during the day felt easier to hold. The wind was cold but not sharp, brushing across the porch like a sigh. He could smell pine and old wood and the faint smoke of a neighbor's chimney in the distance. Shadow stood beside him, close enough for their shoulders to touch. Caleb looked down. The dog tilted his head, just a little, those deep brown eyes catching the last of the light. They didn't sparkle the way they used to, but they still held that same steady fire, that same unwavering awareness. "You still remember," Caleb murmured. Shadow didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark or nudge. He just stood there, waiting, loyal, present. And something in Caleb's chest tightened. Not the kind of pain that hurt, the kind that reminded you were alive, the kind that echoed. For a long moment they didn't move. Then Caleb stepped off the porch. Shadow followed, a beat behind. He didn't need the leash. He never had. Wherever Caleb went, he'd go, whether it was through snow or gunfire, through cities or silence. They walked slowly, down the gravel path that led to the lake, their steps crunching against the frost-dusted earth. Caleb didn't speak, and Shadow didn't make a sound, but the air between them was full, thick with memory. With every step, Caleb thought about the first time Shadow had obeyed that same signal, back in training, back when they were both younger, sharper, hungrier, before the deployments, before the loss, before the silence they'd both carried home like invisible wounds. And now here they were, older, softer, more fragile maybe, but never broken. At the edge of the trees, Caleb stopped. Shadow did too, sat down slowly, carefully. Caleb turned slightly and looked at him again. "Stay close, soldier," he said, just above a whisper. And Shadow, with a sigh that was more breath than sound, leaned his head gently against Caleb's boot, the way he always did. No commands, no performance, just trust. And as the first stars appeared in the fading sky, they stayed like that, man and dog, still, quiet, and together, until the cold deepened, until the darkness wrapped around them like an old blanket, and neither one moved. The wind had died down by evening, leaving the forest heavy in its stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made you hear things you'd rather forget, the hum of your own thoughts, the ghost steps of memory. Snow clung to the window panes in thick layers. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its flames curling lazily around the last of the logs, casting a soft amber glow across the room. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug, an old cigar box open in front of him. The box was battered, the metal hinges loose, its contents long since reduced to a handful of folded photographs, an old campaign ribbon, and a stack of letters bound with twine. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the funeral, not since the flag was handed to him with those practiced, pitying words, "On behalf of a grateful nation." Shadow lay nearby, his body stretched out by the fire, head resting between his paws. His ears twitched occasionally, reacting to some distant sound outside or perhaps just instinct. But his eyes remained half-closed, content to exist in that in-between state of peace and vigilance. Caleb ran his fingers over the stack of letters. Some of them were creased from being opened and reread, smudged in places where his thumb had lingered too long. But one, the one at the very bottom, was still sealed. He stared at it for a long while. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Hannah. No rank, no address, just his name. Written in her hand, slightly slanted, always a little too neat, like she was trying to make up for how messy the world around them was. Caleb swallowed. He hadn't known she'd written one more letter. It must have come after he deployed the last time. Maybe it got buried in a pile of things the Army returned in boxes. Maybe he just didn't want to see it back then. But now he had nothing else to do but feel. He broke the seal. His hands were steady, but the moment the paper unfolded, something in his chest shifted. A crack widening, soft and quiet. He sat back against the couch, letter in hand, and began to read. Caleb, I don't know if this will find you while you're overseas, or if it'll wait for you on some dusty shelf until you're ready to open it. Either way, I needed to write it, just in case words ever get hard to say out loud again. He paused, closing his eyes for a moment. The fire hissed beside him. Shadow, still resting by the hearth, lifted his head slightly, watching. Caleb continued, You've always been the strong one, the silent one, but I've learned that silence doesn't mean peace. It just means you're carrying things no one else can see. And I hope, more than anything, that someday you find someone or something that helps you carry it differently. Caleb blinked. The heat from the fire pressed gently against his face, but his skin had gone cold. The words on the page blurred slightly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. I've loved you in war, in stillness, in absence. But if I had one wish, Caleb, it wouldn't be for your safety. It would be for your softness. I hope something finds you when I'm not there. Something that makes you feel less alone. Something that stays. Caleb let the letter fall to his lap. For a moment the cabin didn't feel like a cabin. It felt like a church, quiet, holy, fragile. He looked over at Shadow. The shepherd was awake now, not in alarm but awareness. He had shifted closer without Caleb noticing. His body didn't touch Caleb's leg, but his presence filled the space like warmth. Then, slowly, Shadow leaned forward and rested his head gently on Caleb's boot. Not a command. Not affection, even. Just being there. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fire crackled. Shadows danced along the ceiling. Outside, snow began to fall again, tiny flakes drifting like ash from an invisible sky. And inside, for the first time in a long time, Caleb felt the unbearable weight of silence soften. The snow didn't stop, not really. It came in slow drifts, sometimes so light it looked like dust in sunlight, sometimes thick enough to cover the steps Caleb had shoveled just hours before. But life in the cabin settled into a rhythm, one that didn't mind the weather or the quiet or the things left unsaid. Every morning Caleb rose before the sun, pulled on his boots, and stepped out into the cold. He no longer moved like a soldier, but the discipline never quite left him. Shadow would wait by the door, not barking, not pacing, just sitting, watching, ready. Together they walked the ridge above the tree line, boots and paws crunching in the fresh snow, breath fogging the air. Caleb didn't leash him anymore. He didn't need to. Shadow followed by choice, not command, a few steps behind, always keeping an eye. They rarely made noise. The world didn't ask them to, but somewhere in the rhythm of shared silence, something began to shift. At breakfast, Caleb would make 2 plates, one with eggs and toast for himself, one with ground chicken and warm rice for Shadow. He'd talk as he cooked, not out of habit, not even to break the silence, but because it started to feel safe. "Snow's heavier today," he'd mumble, stirring the eggs. Shadow would tilt his head. "And that wood pile's shrinking faster than I thought." A blink, a slow wag. At first it was just practical things. Weather, tasks, comments under breath. But over time, other words found their way out. Words that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Like her name. One night, as they sat by the fire, Caleb sipped whiskey from an old canteen. He stared into the flames a long while before saying, almost too softly, "Hannah would have liked you." Shadow, half asleep, perked his ears. Caleb stared into the hearth. "She didn't trust many people. Not after I came back different." A pause. "But she had a thing for eyes. Said you could see truth there." Shadow lifted his head. "You've got those eyes." No response, no bark, just stillness. Later, while stacking firewood, Caleb dropped a log and let out a frustrated sigh. "She used to say I was stubborn. Called it my ruin and my armor," he muttered, wiping snow from his brow. "I told her I didn't know how else to be." From the porch, Shadow let out a low huff. Not a bark, not a growl, just enough to let Caleb know he was listening. And in the evenings, after the dishes were done and the fire stoked low, they would sit, man and dog, in the same spots. Caleb with his back to the couch, knees pulled in, Shadow curled just an arm's length away. Sometimes Caleb would talk, sometimes he wouldn't. But when he did, the words came from somewhere raw. "I didn't get to say goodbye." Shadow's ear flicked. "I was halfway through a 12-month rotation. They called me at 2 a.m. I thought it was some supply screw-up." He exhaled. It wasn't. A beat. "She was already gone by the time I got to the hospital." The cabin creaked in the cold. The fire snapped. "And I—" His voice broke. "I never said I was sorry." Shadow didn't move, didn't nudge closer. He just kept his eyes on Caleb, unwavering, unafraid of pain. That night, Caleb spoke Hannah's name again. And this time it didn't feel like stepping off a cliff. It felt like coming back from one. The days passed like this. Walks, meals, quiet rituals. And the man who once measured time by deployments and casualty reports now measured it in smaller things. The weight of a bowl, the turn of Shadow's head when he heard home, the subtle way their footsteps synced as they moved through the trees. Some connections aren't built in noise. Some healing doesn't need permission. And sometimes the soul listens best when no one is watching. The storm had passed sometime in the night. By morning the woods were hushed under a new coat of snow, clean and untouched, as if the world had been rewritten in white. Caleb stood on the porch, coffee steaming between his hands. The silence wasn't heavy today. It was expectant, light, like something had shifted, without needing a reason. Shadow sat a few feet away, watching the tree line. He'd been more alert lately, not restless, just tuned in. There was a kind of stillness between them, but no longer the kind born of grief. This was different. Alive. Caleb glanced toward the open space behind the cabin, a patch of flattened snow surrounded by pine. An idea sparked. He set his mug down, pulled on his gloves, and walked into the clearing. At first he moved without words, just gathering what was already there: fallen logs, firewood stumps, 2 rusted buckets, a plank of scrap wood leaning against the shed. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. Within half an hour he had something that resembled a crude agility path, a log to jump, a line of snow mounds to weave through, the plank balanced on cinder blocks like a shaky seesaw. He turned. Shadow had followed, quietly, head tilted. "Well," Caleb muttered, brushing snow from his jacket, "I figure we both could use a stretch." Shadow blinked slowly, like he understood the offer more than the words. Caleb took a breath. Then, softly, he raised his hand and pointed to the log. "Up." There was a pause. And then, like muscle memory firing through scarred bone, Shadow moved. He limped forward with care, not fast, not perfect, but committed. With one sure motion, he hopped over the log and landed on the other side. Caleb's brows lifted, surprised. "You still got it." Shadow turned back, eyes bright. They tried the weave next. Caleb stepped between the snow mounds, using only his fingers to guide the path. Shadow followed, weaving side to side, slower on the injured leg, but focused. Ears forward, eyes on Caleb. It wasn't about performance. It was about trust. At the plank, Shadow hesitated. It wobbled. The sound reminded him of metal ramps, of sirens in the distance, of sharp commands and gunpowder. His paw drew back. Caleb knelt, palm outstretched. "It's okay. No one's rushing you." A beat passed, and then slowly Shadow stepped up, one paw, then the next. He made it across, trembling but upright. And when he reached the other side, Caleb exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And then he laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not a dry exhale. A full, unfiltered laugh that cracked open the cold and startled a bird from the tree above. Shadow perked up, tail giving a tentative wag. Caleb wiped his eyes. "God, I haven't done that in—" He shook his head. "You really are something, you know that?" Shadow walked over, bumping his head gently against Caleb's hand. It was the first time he'd initiated touch. They stood like that for a while, man and dog, surrounded by crooked obstacles buried half-deep in snow. What once was a training course had turned into a silent monument. Wooden planks leaning at odd angles, posts splintered by weather, a rusting tunnel pipe now filled with frozen leaves. Time had softened everything here, except the bond between them. Caleb rested a hand on his knee, catching his breath. Shadow stood beside him, not in any formal heel, not out of duty. They weren't soldier and handler now. They hadn't been for a long time. What kept them tethered wasn't protocol or command. It was something deeper, older, a quiet, wordless promise, a need to feel useful again, to be seen again, to play again. Shadow pawed at the snow clumsily, trying to nudge a long-forgotten training dummy free from the drift. His movements were stiff, but his tail gave a slow, earnest wag. Caleb couldn't help but smile. "You remember this place, huh?" he whispered, watching Shadow nudge the half-frozen rubber toward him like an offering. "You old show-off." The words held no sharpness, just warmth, like sunlight through clouds. He knelt down, joints protesting, and took the toy in his hands. It was cracked, brittle in spots. But Shadow's eyes lit up in that way they used to, that way Caleb hadn't seen in months. Maybe years. That fire, small but stubborn, still burned. So Caleb tossed it, just a few feet, and Shadow lunged after it, as best as his aging legs would allow. He stumbled once, slipped on a patch of ice, but kept going, awkward, determined, joyful. He brought it back, chin held high, snow clinging to his whiskers like white confetti. Caleb laughed, a low, surprised sound that caught in his throat. It wasn't a laugh born from something funny. It was the kind that came when your chest cracked open just enough to let light in. Joy had snuck in quietly, without ceremony. Not loud or flashy, not the kind that bursts like fireworks, but the kind that slips through when you're not guarding the door, when the pain quiets for just long enough for something else to breathe. A flicker, barely there, but enough. Enough to remind Caleb what it felt like to feel light again, to forget for a second the weight he carried. Enough to remind him that life didn't always have to be heavy, that even grief, when shared with someone who never asked for words, could be softened. He looked down at Shadow, panting, trembling slightly but proud, and he knelt beside him. "Still got it?" Caleb said, ruffling the thick fur behind his ears. Shadow leaned into the touch, and for a moment, neither of them were soldiers anymore. Not haunted men, not retired warriors, just two old friends, playing in the snow, letting the world fade away around them. The air had changed. It wasn't quite winter anymore, but spring hadn't arrived either. That in-between hush settled over the trees like a held breath. The snow was melting in patches, revealing dark earth and veins of moss slick with meltwater. Caleb adjusted his pack and glanced behind him. "You ready?" Shadow stood at the edge of the trail, alert but calm. His gait had improved, still limping, but stronger now, steadier. There was a quiet pride in how he carried himself, as if walking beside Caleb wasn't just exercise, but duty. Purpose. They crossed the wooden stile and stepped off the well-tread path, following a faint trail that wove deeper into the forest. Caleb hadn't taken this route in years. Not since before everything collapsed. Tall evergreens rose on either side, their roots exposed like old bones curled through the soil. Light filtered through the needles in soft ribbons. A raven called overhead. Then, stillness again. The farther they walked, the more the world seemed to fall away behind them. Caleb said little. He didn't need to. There was something sacred about silence out here, not empty but full of meaning. When he exhaled, he could see his breath. The air still held winter's teeth. Shadow kept close, ears rotating like twin radars. Once he stopped, body rigid, nose raised. Caleb paused too. "What is it?" But after a beat, Shadow moved on. Caleb followed. They came to a clearing where a massive pine tree towered like a sentinel. Its trunk was wide enough that 3 men holding hands couldn't wrap around it. Moss grew thick at its base, and beneath it, a trickle of meltwater wound through the roots like a living thread. Caleb placed a hand on the bark. It was cool, alive. "She used to call this one the Old King," he murmured. Shadow sat beside him, eyes scanning the treetops as if expecting something to descend. A few birds flitted above. Wind whispered through the branches. And then Caleb stepped forward. There was no warning, no snap of a branch, no cry, just silence. And then he was gone. One step, and the earth swallowed him whole. The ground beneath had rotted from inside, forming a soft shell of moss and old snow concealing a sinkhole beneath. It caved without sound, dragging Caleb into the dark. Shadow lunged, barking now, sharp, guttural. Not fear, action. He skidded toward the edge and peered down. Below, Caleb had landed on his side, half covered in loose soil and pine needles. His breath came in gasps, not from pain but shock. He twisted upward and groaned, trying to move. His right leg didn't follow. "Damn it!" Shadow circled the opening, whining. "Stay there," Caleb managed, reaching up. But the edge was too high. The walls were soft, crumbling. Climbing out was impossible. For a long moment, all he could hear was his own breath and the sound of meltwater trickling somewhere below. The pit was narrow, no wider than a grave, and damp air closed in. Shadow barked again. Caleb looked up, locking eyes with the dog. "Hey, easy. I'm okay." The lie was thin. Shadow didn't move. He just stared, ears forward, eyes locked. A sentry frozen in place. Caleb rested his head against the wall. The sky above looked so far now. His voice cracked when he said it, but he said it anyway. "Good boy. Go get help." Shadow didn't budge. The pain came all at once, sharp, white-hot, and merciless. Caleb couldn't breathe for a moment. The wind had been knocked clean from his lungs when he hit the bottom, a muffled thud swallowed by damp earth and rotting pine. He lay twisted in the cramped space, gasping against the cold that pressed in on all sides. A hollow. An old den, maybe. Some kind of widened burrow eaten away by erosion and meltwater over years. The air smelled of damp fur, of soil left untouched for decades. His leg was wrong. He didn't need to look to know it. The bone throbbed beneath the surface like a live wire. Every attempt to move it made his vision blur at the edges. Above him, Shadow paced the rim of the sinkhole, whining low and desperate. "Easy," Caleb wheezed, voice barely audible. He groped for his phone, pulled it from his jacket with trembling fingers. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks. He thumbed the power button. Nothing. Dead. A dead battery in the middle of nowhere, 15 miles from the nearest paved road. And even if it had worked, who would he have called? There was no one left. No one but the dog circling above like a soul tethered to him. Caleb closed his eyes against the pulsing ache and tried to think. Panic sat just beneath his ribs, waiting to spill over. He bit it back with force. Panic would kill him faster than the cold. "Shadow," he called, and it came out hoarse. The dog barked once, loud, frustrated. Shadow's paws crunched against the soft earth as he darted from side to side, seeking a way down. Once, he tried to edge closer, claws scrambling at the rim. "No," Caleb growled. "Don't you dare." Shadow froze. Watched. The silence between them was full of noise, wind through trees, his own ragged breath, a distant bird call that felt like it came from another world. Then Caleb said it. Through clenched teeth, every syllable laced with pain and command. "Go. Go home, soldier. That's an order." Shadow didn't move. "I said, go!" Caleb's voice cracked. "You remember this? You know this?" And Shadow did. Something flickered in the dog's eyes. Not fear, not confusion. Obedience. Reluctant. Heavy. A long pause. Then, with one final whine, Shadow turned and ran. Caleb let his head fall back, wincing as the jolt sent fire through his leg. He looked up at the slice of sky, narrowing now as evening crept in. He whispered, more to himself than to the wind, "Please come back." Then the world tilted, and everything went still again. Shadow ran like the past was chasing him. Snowmelt sprayed up around his legs as he tore through the woods, paws hammering the softened earth. The trail behind him was chaotic. Broken branches, streaks of slush, claw marks dug deep into the bark of trees. But he didn't slow down. There was no handler shouting commands, no radio, no leash. Only the mission, the one etched into his bones long before the cage, long before the shelter, long before the silence. Find help. Save him. Go. The wind stung his scarred ear as he leapt over a patch of frozen stream, landing hard. His back leg faltered, the one that never healed right, and he collapsed mid-stride. A bark tore from his throat as pain knifed through the joint. For a second he didn't move. He lay there, flanks heaving, steam rising from his body in the cold morning air. The silence around him was absolute. No birdsong, no footsteps, only breath. And then, from deep inside, something ancient, a memory. A uniformed voice, once firm, once kind. "Even if I fall, you finish the mission, you hear me? You never leave a man behind." Shadow staggered up. One leg trembled beneath him, but he stayed standing. He turned his muzzle toward the north slope, the direction of the neighboring cabin, the old McAllister place, and ran. Not fast, not graceful, but forward. Every muscle in his body screamed with effort, but he pushed on. Each step carved a new promise into the earth. He is mine to protect. Frost crunched beneath his paws. A raven scattered from a tree above as he burst into the clearing. The wooden fence came into view, weathered, leaning. A rusted wind chime spun lazily on the porch of the small house tucked between two hills. Shadow crossed the threshold without pause. He barked. Once. Twice. Then again louder, frantic, guttural, the kind of bark that carried urgency, not threat. A sound no real dog makes unless something is wrong. Inside, a kettle whistled. The door creaked open and a woman stepped out. Early 60s, gray coat half zipped, holding a mug and confusion on her face. "Hey now," she said cautiously. "Whose boy are you?" Shadow barked again, took 2 steps backward, turned and barked once more toward the trees. Then he looked back. Eyes locked on hers, wide, dark, pleading. "What's going on?" she asked, setting the mug down. "What's the matter?" Shadow gave a sharp yelp, turned again, and ran to the edge of the clearing. He didn't vanish into the woods. He stopped and looked back, chest heaving, waiting, inviting, begging. And something in the woman shifted. Maybe it was the way his tail was low, not out of fear, but urgency. Maybe it was the streaks of mud clinging to his coat, like he'd run through the woods without caring where his paws landed. Or maybe it was the eyes. That look. The kind of look dogs aren't supposed to give. The kind that speaks without sound. The kind that says, "Come now," or someone dies. For a moment she didn't move. Her fingers hovered in the air, caught between reaching for logic and instinct. But the moment passed, or maybe it cracked, and when it did, all the old training, all the mother's gut, all the parts of her that still believed in something bigger than coincidence, surged forward like breath after drowning. She grabbed her coat. Her phone slipped once from her hand, but she caught it. Her fingers shook now. She couldn't find the sleeves. "Hang on," she muttered, barely above a whisper. "I'm coming. Show me." Shadow barked. Once. Not frantic. Not scared. Just clear. Certain. Urgent. Then he turned. Not sprinting, not rushing, but fast enough to lead, and slow enough to let her follow. She ran after him, boots pounding against wet soil, heart thundering in her chest. Each breath came sharp, half from panic, half from knowing deep down this wasn't just a stray dog. This wasn't just some random bark in the night. This meant something. Ahead, Shadow wove through the trees, glancing back every few steps, eyes locking with hers like a promise. It wasn't just direction, it was a mission. Something buried deep inside her recognized that rhythm, that urgency. She used to be a responder once. Before the grief, before the silence swallowed her world. But now, under the pale canopy of trembling branches and fading twilight, that old part of her woke again. This was a call to action, not a command, a plea. She stumbled on a root, caught herself. Mud splashed across her jeans. Shadow paused just ahead, ears twitching, then continued. No time to check in, no time to comfort. Whatever was happening, it was still happening. And behind them, for the first time in years, a mission had begun again. It wasn't official. There was no team, no radio, no briefing. Just a woman who had once known what it meant to answer the call. And a dog who had never stopped hearing it. Branches scraped her arms. The wind picked up, colder now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And somewhere, ahead, unseen, was the reason. A life, a moment, a chance. She didn't know who or what yet, but she followed anyway. Because when a dog like that comes to your door, covered in dirt, eyes like fire, breathing like hope, you don't question. You run. The forest was still waking when they heard it. "Over here!" the woman shouted, crashing through the brush behind Shadow, her boots skidding on the melting undergrowth. "He's leading us. Just keep up." Shadow limped ahead, his breathing sharp, hoarse. His coat was dark with sweat and dirt, but his eyes stayed fixed on the slope where Caleb had vanished. Every few steps he looked back, made sure they hadn't lost him, then forward again. 2 men and the woman trailed behind, neighbors from the next ridge, roused by her frantic call. One of them held a radio. The other clutched a first aid kit that looked too clean for what they might find. "Dog's got a purpose," the older man muttered between breaths. "You can see it in the way he moves." Minutes passed like hours until Shadow reached the clearing. The wind whistled low between the trees, and the ground near the edge sloped down into a half-hidden hollow. He stopped at the rim, ears forward, and let out one low, steady whine. The woman scanned the area, eyes frantic. "Caleb?" Silence. Then, faint, hoarse, but unmistakable. "Down here." They rushed to the edge and peered down. There, twisted among damp roots and collapsed earth, lay Caleb. His jacket was torn, one arm clutching his leg at a wrong angle. His face was pale, lips cracked, but he managed a grim smile. "I knew he'd come back," he whispered. Shadow sat at the edge, watching him. His ears twitched at the sound of Caleb's voice, a sound he hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. He let out one soft chuff and lowered himself, tail tapping once against the ground, just once. All he had left. Sirens wailed in the far distance now, carried on wind and melting snow. Relief came in fragments. The EMTs arrived fast, all motion and coordination. Ropes, stretchers, radios crackling, voices urgent but controlled. Vitals are low, but he's lucid. Fracture on the femur, possible hypothermia. We'll need to airlift. As they lowered themselves into the pit, Shadow didn't move from the edge. He watched it all, every wince, every clipped instruction, as if cataloging it, as if refusing to leave his post until the mission was complete. When they lifted Caleb out, wrapped tight in thermal blankets, he caught sight of the dog, eyes barely open, chest heaving. He managed 2 words before they wheeled him toward the ambulance. "Good boy." Shadow blinked slowly, chest rising and falling like a tired tide. One of the EMTs approached, crouching beside him. "He yours?" Shadow didn't answer, of course, but he didn't run. He allowed the hand to rest gently on his head, just between the ears. The woman knelt beside him next. "You saved him. Don't think I've ever seen anything like that." Shadow leaned, just slightly, into her hand. Then his body gave out. Not in collapse, but in surrender. He curled into the soft moss near the crater, finally letting the world blur at the edges. His tail gave one more flick. Not for joy, not even for triumph, but acknowledgement. He had done his part. The rest, now, was up to them. The first photo was grainy, a still from someone's phone, but it was enough. Shadow standing on the ridge, chest heaving, snow tangled in his coat, ears alert like a soldier awaiting orders. Caleb's stretcher just visible behind him, framed by EMTs and neighbors with raw eyes and trembling hands. The headline in the Pine Valley Echo ran the next morning: "Wounded War Dog Saves Owner from Remote Forest Pit." The subheading told more than it meant to. They'd barely spoken in weeks, but when it mattered most, he remembered. By noon, the story had jumped counties, then states, then platforms. Shadow's face, battle-scarred, quiet, resolute, was shared thousands of times across social media. A tweet labeled him the silent hero. A Facebook post read, "The dog didn't bark, he just ran and saved a man's life." On Reddit, someone unearthed his military record. People cried over it. Artists painted him. Children drew him. By the second day, a veterans advocacy group had called, then a podcast. Then a journalist from Denver who wanted to write a long-form piece about loyalty and healing. But Caleb knew none of that when he first woke in the hospital. The ceiling above him was dull and white, humming with fluorescent light. His leg was bound tight in a splint, raised slightly. Pain flickered behind his ribs like an aftershock. He blinked groggily at the figure by the window. Nurse Haley, young, sharp-eyed, and unapologetically nosy. "You're awake," she said, tapping her pen against a clipboard. "You've gone viral, you know." Caleb groaned. "That sounds contagious," she grinned. "You have no idea. Your dog's famous." "My dog?" She tilted her head. "Big Shepherd? War vet like you? Saved your life, or so everyone's saying." Caleb struggled to sit up, breath caught in his throat. "Shadow." "Yep. That's what they're calling him in the article. Shadow. Like he never left your side." She held out the paper, folded neatly. His name was in bold, so was Shadow's. He stared at it, unmoving, eyes slowly scanning each word. The photos blurred in and out. Shadow beside the stretcher, Shadow being loaded gently into a neighbor's car, Shadow lying beside a cot with IV tubes leading into his paw. It was too much, too close. He looked away, swallowing something sharp in his throat. "Where is he?" "At the vet clinic. They say he's stable, exhausted but recovering. Kind of like someone else I know." She checked his chart, then looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "You okay with all this attention?" He said nothing for a moment, then, "We didn't ask for it." "No," she agreed, "but sometimes stories ask for you." She left, and the room went quiet again. Caleb rested the paper on his chest. The headline still burned against his shirt. Silent Hero. Second Chances. The Dog Who Remembered. He let out a slow breath. Something in him ached deeper than bone. He hadn't told them about the nightmares, or the way he'd once thought of returning Shadow to the shelter, or how he'd spoken to him in the woods not as a pet, but as a soldier, expecting a soldier's obedience. He hadn't told them what Shadow really did that day. He didn't just fetch help. He gave Caleb back the one thing he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. The camera lenses would never catch that. But Caleb remembered. The town hall wasn't large, just a red brick building with aging wood beams, and a community room that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old pine. But that day, it held more people than it had in years. The folding chairs creaked with the weight of neighbors, veterans, children, and strangers who had driven in from other towns just to see him. Not Caleb, him, Shadow. He stood by Caleb's side, a new harness snug around his ribs. The old scars across his flank were still visible beneath the short fur, like war stories told in silence. His ears twitched at the murmur of the crowd, but he didn't flinch. He stood steady, still, watching everything. A hush settled when the mayor stepped forward. She was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "Sometimes," she began, "a story reminds us who we are, not just as individuals, but as a community, as people who believe in sacrifice, in loyalty, in second chances." She turned toward the German shepherd at her side, voice thickening. Shadow didn't ask for applause. He didn't ask to be remembered. He simply acted, and in doing so, reminded all of us what love, real, selfless love looks like. There were no cheers, only a long, respectful silence. Then, carefully, she reached into a velvet box and pulled out a silver medallion on a blue ribbon. Below it, the words, "Service, loyalty, bravery." With slow hands, she leaned forward and clipped it onto Shadow's harness. He didn't react except to glance back at Caleb, just a flick of the eye, enough to say, "I'm still with you." The mayor stepped aside, gesturing to Caleb. He hadn't prepared a speech. There were no note cards, no rehearsed phrases, just the weight of everything he hadn't said. He took the mic with both hands, cleared his throat once. "I was a soldier for most of my life," he said. "And in war, you don't survive by accident. You survive because someone has your six." He looked down at Shadow. "I didn't rescue him. He rescued me, twice." A breath. The room held it with him. "The first time was when we were both younger. Different uniforms. Same dust in our lungs. The second time was 2 weeks ago, in the woods behind my cabin, when I thought I was going to die in a hole no one would ever find." He knelt slightly, hand resting on Shadow's back. "And I gave him a command. Old words from an old life. 'Go home.'" His voice cracked. "He didn't go because I told him to. He went because that's what brothers do." The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. A few quiet tears. A veteran stood and saluted. A child clutched their mother's hand and whispered, "That dog's a hero." Afterward, people approached carefully, some with photos, others with thanks. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't need to. His presence was a language everyone understood. Caleb watched from behind as an older woman knelt before the shepherd and pressed her forehead gently to his. "You came back," she whispered, tears streaking down her cheek. "You came back when it counted." And Shadow, ever still, let her cry into his fur, like she was mourning someone she never got to bring home. No one noticed when Caleb stepped away to the edge of the crowd, eyes scanning the sky as if expecting something more to fall. But when he looked down, Shadow was already beside him, silent, present, alive, wearing a medal not just for what he did, but for who he never stopped being. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the woods lay blanketed in silence. Spring had not yet fully awakened the forest, and snow still clung to the branches like secrets not yet spoken. Caleb was halfway through a page of an old paperback when he heard it, the unmistakable creak of weight shifting on the porch. Not a heavy thud, but the soft, rhythmic sound of paws against wood. He glanced at the clock. 12:47 a.m. Shadow was pacing. Not stretching, not settling. Pacing. Caleb sat up, listening. The cabin had grown eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that didn't feel peaceful, more like breath being held. He rose from the couch and stepped toward the front door, opening it just enough to look outside. There, beneath the pale wash of moonlight, Shadow moved back and forth with precision, each step deliberate, not frantic, but alert. His ears were forward, body tense, muscles low to the ground like a coiled spring. His nose kept lifting slightly, testing the air. And then Caleb heard it, a low growl, almost inaudible, the kind that wasn't meant to intimidate but to warn. Something was off. Caleb stepped onto the porch, arms crossed against the chill. "Shadow?" he said softly. The dog paused, barely glanced back. His eyes were locked on the tree line, the darkest edge where the lantern light no longer reached. Another growl. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing. Just thick pines and the soft hiss of snow melting into the ground. But the silence was wrong, too complete. No owls, no wind, no crunch of thawing ice falling from the eaves. Then Shadow barked, sharp, sudden, one loud burst that echoed into the woods. Caleb stiffened. Shadow didn't bark, not unless it mattered. He crouched next to him, fingers brushing the dog's shoulder. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd didn't move. His body was rigid, tail low but not tucked. His breath came out steady, measured. "I don't see anything." Shadow took one step forward, then another, stopping at the porch's edge, sniffing the air like memory itself lingered in it. And then another sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Metal. Not natural, not animal, not forest. A subtle click, like a latch, or a door swinging slowly shut far off. Caleb's jaw tightened. His instincts kicked in like an old muscle he hadn't used in years. Not fear. Something colder, more practiced. He reached for the flashlight inside the doorway and scanned the tree line. Nothing. Still, the sense of being watched pressed down on him like fog. Shadow moved again, circling the perimeter of the porch like he was guarding it. Not barking now, just breathing hard through his nose, keeping close to the door, occasionally glancing at Caleb for confirmation. "You feel it too, don't you?" "I know," Caleb murmured, eyes narrowing. "I feel it." They stood together in the hush of that strange night, two survivors haunted by wars, one abroad, one within, and now something unnamed in the woods. And though the wind never rose and no intruder ever revealed themselves, the feeling didn't leave. Shadow didn't lie down, and Caleb didn't go back to sleep. The quiet had changed. And in the morning, they would find the tracks at the edge of the clearing, too deep, too fresh, and too human to ignore. It started with glass, the kind of shatter that slices through sleep like a blade. Caleb was up before his eyes fully opened, boots half-laced, hand reaching for the flashlight on the table as Shadow launched from the front door with a bark so deep it felt like thunder cracking across the ribcage. One bark, then two, then silence, then another crash. Caleb pushed open the door, the cold night air swallowing his breath. The sound had come from across the road, an old hunting cabin long since abandoned, the porch collapsed in places, but still upright enough to be a temptation for the wrong kind of person. Shadow was already at the base of their porch steps, head lowered, hackles up, growl rumbling low and constant like the hum of a storm gathering. The flashlight beam cut across the road and landed on jagged edges of glass strewn across a broken window pane. And just beyond it, movement, a shadow within shadows. "Stay," Caleb ordered instinctively, voice low but clipped. Shadow didn't obey. He never really had, not since the fall, not since the forest. But this time, he paused. Just enough. Caleb crossed the icy road with care, beam fixed on the door now half open, the hinges creaking like they hadn't moved in years. He stepped lightly, years of training reawakening in his blood despite the limp that still haunted his left leg. Inside, the beam caught motion again. A figure, startled, male, young, maybe 17, clothes torn like he'd been living rough or hiding from something worse. The boy stumbled backward, knocking into a shelf and sending a pan clattering to the floor. "Hey!" Caleb barked. "Don't move!" But the boy bolted straight out the back exit, and that's when Shadow moved. A blur of instinct and precision, his paws hammering the half-frozen ground as he rounded the cabin's edge. Caleb chased, breath rising in clouds, heart thudding not with panic, but something closer to fury or clarity. They circled the cabin, flashlight catching movement in the bushes just as Shadow surged forward, and then it was over. A cry, not of pain but of surrender. Shadow stood firm, not touching the boy, just blocking his path. His body low, ears forward, growl gone. Just breath now, warm and steady and unflinching. The kid froze, hands raised. I didn't know anyone lived around here, I swear." Caleb approached slowly, flashlight on the boy's face now. Young, pale, filthy. Desperation soaked into every seam of his oversized jacket. "You broke a window." "I was cold," the kid muttered. "Just needed a place. I didn't mean—" Shadow stepped forward slightly. Just one step. Just enough. The boy shut his mouth. Caleb pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the call button. But something in him paused. The look in the kid's eyes wasn't violent. It was hollow. Edges of hunger, of being unseen for too long. He looked at Shadow. The dog was watching the boy, not with threat, but something almost familiar. The way you watch someone who's lost the map but still wants to find the road. Caleb exhaled slowly. He holstered the flashlight. "Come on," he said. "Back to my porch. I'll call the sheriff and let them figure this out." To his surprise, the boy followed. Shadow brought up the rear, never turning his back, never looking away. Later, when the cruiser pulled up and the deputy took the boy into the warmth of the back seat, Caleb stood on his porch with Shadow at his heel. The quiet returned, but not the same kind. "What tipped you off?" Caleb asked, his voice hoarse from adrenaline. Shadow didn't answer, of course, but he shifted closer, and his tail thumped once against Caleb's boot. And for the first time that winter, Caleb realized something. Shadow wasn't just recovering anymore. He was working again, and whatever pieces of the soldier still lived in Caleb, they were waking up too. It wasn't supposed to make the news, just a glass break, a trespasser, no injuries, no arrests. But Shadow was involved, and that changed everything. By midweek, the local paper ran the story again. "Guardian of the Block," the headline read, bold across the front page above a candid photo of Shadow sitting alert on Caleb's porch. In the shot, his ears were perked, eyes sharp, one paw slightly lifted as if mid-command, a silent sentinel carved in muscle and trust. Someone left a copy on Caleb's doorstep with a sticky note. "Your boy's a legend. Marcy, Unit 3. Caleb didn't know how to respond to that. So he didn't, not with words. Instead, he opened his shed. By evening, the soft knock of hammer on wood echoed through the yard. Caleb worked slow, steady, each nail driven in with a care that felt closer to prayer than carpentry. The old pine board had been sitting in the back corner since before the fall, meant for something else once. Now it had purpose. By morning the sign was up. Simple. Burned letters, rough edges smoothed by hand. It read, "Protected by Shadow, Hero, Hound, Brother." He hung it on the fence by the gate, right where it caught the morning light. And that's when the drawings started arriving. Little hands, uncertain lines. Shadow drawn with a red cape, a lightning bolt on his collar, paws exaggerated, and smiling mouths wide enough to fill the paper. Some were folded into envelopes, addressed in block letters, to the dog hero. Others were taped to the fence with pride, fluttering like flags in the spring breeze. One morning, a group of neighborhood kids stood on the sidewalk, watching Shadow from a safe distance. He sat by the porch as always, tail sweeping slowly across the wood, head tilted just enough to acknowledge them, but not approach. A boy with freckles whispered, "Is that really him?" Another nodded. "He stopped the bad guy." They stayed a minute longer, then scampered off. But one girl turned back. She left a drawing tucked in the fence slat, a crayon picture of a house, a stick figure man, and a dog in the center, shaded with browns and blacks. She'd written beneath it, "Shadow keeps us safe." Caleb found it hours later. He didn't say a word, just folded it carefully, set it on the mantel next to Hannah's last letter, and stood for a long moment staring out the window. Shadow moved to his side, sat tall, and for the first time in weeks, Caleb rested his hand not on the dog's back, but across his chest, right where that little girl had drawn the cape. He didn't speak aloud, but if he had, it would have been something like this. "You were never just a dog, were you?" Time didn't stop. It simply softened. From spring through fall, the days stretched long and slow in the valley. Mornings arrived like a secret kept between the trees, with dew still clinging to the grass and birds breaking the hush with their scattered songs. Caleb and Shadow rose together before the world stirred. No alarms, no rush, just quiet footsteps on old floorboards and the gentle creak of the porch swing as Caleb laced his boots. They took the same path each morning, boots and paws in rhythm, dust and pine needles crunching beneath them. Sometimes they spoke. Most times they didn't need to. Caleb had stopped counting the miles. It wasn't about distance now. It was about movement, breath, silence, healing that didn't announce itself. Somewhere along the way, a new routine found them. It began one morning with Caleb pointing at the leather gloves he'd dropped near the workbench. "Can you grab those, bud?" Shadow paused, ears flicking. Then gently, he picked them up, brought them over, tail wagging once. The look Caleb gave him wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition, trust, layered over memory. From that morning on, they worked together, not in any grand way. No more combat, no commands barked across battlefield wind, just small things, a screwdriver here, the rolled-up newspaper, a pair of garden shears left on the back steps. Shadow learned with a kind of reverence, as if every act was its own quiet mission. Sometimes Caleb caught himself smiling at the dog's concentration, the slow tilt of his head when presented with something new. Once, when Shadow brought over a hammer by the handle carefully, teeth only grazing the worn wood, Caleb chuckled, low and surprised. That sound had been buried so long it startled even him. By midsummer, their front porch had become something sacred. Shadow would lie beside the rocking chair, eyes half closed, breathing deep the dusk air. Caleb sat with a mug of coffee that often went cold, humming melodies from long ago, pieces of lullabies, half-remembered songs his father used to sing while whittling on that same porch. There was one tune he returned to more than others. No words, just the rise and fall of a melody that felt like home. Every time he hummed it, Shadow would lift his head slightly as if listening for something buried in the music. And maybe he was. Nights stretched on that way stars thick overhead, crickets stitching together the silence, and two souls leaning gently into the present, neither asking for more than what was already there. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't newsworthy, but it was peace. And for a man who'd once slept with one eye open on foreign soil, who'd buried a wife and nearly lost himself in the smoke of memory, it was more than enough. The first frost came early that year, a soft lace of white across the grass, thin as breath, but firm in its reminder. The seasons had turned. Shadow noticed it first. Not with complaint, he never had, but in the way he rose a little slower from his spot by the hearth, the way his back legs hesitated before the jump onto the porch, just once, then again, the next day. Caleb said nothing at first. He just watched the way Shadow still greeted the morning with that slow tail wag, watched how his ears perked at the sound of the mail slot, how he still tilted his head at the word Hannah, watched, most of all, how the fire in those amber eyes never dimmed, only steadied, like coals glowing beneath the ash. One afternoon, Caleb laid planks of sanded pine across sawhorses, hammer in hand. Shadow rested nearby, head on crossed paws, eyes tracking every movement like he understood what was being built. The ramp wasn't fancy, just a slope from the porch to the frozen ground, braced and sanded smooth. When it was done, Caleb stepped back and gave a soft whistle. "Try it out, soldier." Shadow stood, tested it, walked up slow, then turned, came back down. Tail flicked once, as if in thanks. From that day on, the ramp became part of their rhythm. No ceremony. Just quiet acknowledgement of time moving forward, not as an enemy, but as a companion. They spoke less now, but the silence wasn't hollow. It was full of understanding, of shared glances by the fire, of Caleb placing an old flannel over Shadow's back on colder nights without a word, of Shadow nudging Caleb's hand during evening storms, not in fear, just to remind him they were both still here. Sometimes, when Caleb hummed those half-remembered songs on the porch, Shadow would lift his head, ears twitching, eyes closed, as if dreaming not of war or loss, but of long walks, slow mornings, and the way pine trees smell in early snow. Their bond had never needed language, but now, in the stillness of the nearing winter, it deepened into something quieter, something sacred. It wasn't about what they used to be. It was about who they had become together. The snow had come overnight, heavy and slow, muting the world beneath a blanket thick enough to silence even the wind. Caleb stepped outside with a mug of black coffee, cradled in his hands, the heat rising in thin curls against his weathered face. The air bit through the wool of his sleeves, sharp and real, but it was the kind of cold that reminded him he was still here. Shadow followed, padding quietly behind him. There was no urgency to their mornings anymore. No checklist, no mission, no perimeter to secure. Just the routine of presence and a silence that somehow was never empty. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch, boots anchored in snow-dusted boards. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, his voice, rough, low, but gentle, carried into the quiet like a thread reaching back through time. "Stay close, soldier." The words weren't barked like they once were. They were an offering now, almost a whisper. Shadow, already at his side, responded with a quiet grace. No dramatic movement, no theatrics. Just a simple shift of weight and a soft sigh as he sat down, his flank pressed to Caleb's shin, and then slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and rested his chin across the top of Caleb's boot. Caleb didn't move. He only stared out into the white where the tree line blurred into the horizon and falling snow made ghosts of the pines. Memories stirred, not of battles, not of blood, but of moments like this, of stillness after storms, of familiar weight at his side, of a presence that didn't ask anything but offered everything. He didn't say, "Good boy." He didn't have to. They sat together like that, unmoving. One man, one aging dog, and a silence so deep it felt like the world had paused just to watch them be. And in that quiet under snowfall that whispered of times passing, Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Shadow's ears twitched, but he didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. He was already exactly where he was meant to be. The kettle had barely begun to hiss when Caleb stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, wrapped in the flannel hush of dawn. The air was cold, but not bitter. Just still. The kind of stillness that held something sacred or final. He sipped slowly, letting the heat settle in his chest. The horizon wore a pale blush, the trees standing motionless like they, too, were waiting for the sun to speak. His eyes drifted to the far corner of the porch, where the blanket was bunched up in the same way it always was, like it had been shaped by habit, by weight, by presence. Shadow lay there, curled against the wooden boards, muzzle tucked near his chest. Peaceful. Caleb took a step closer, then paused. There was something different in the silence now. Not absence, not yet, but a kind of stillness that went deeper than sleep. He lowered the mug, heartbeat slowing. "Shadow?" he said, almost reflexively. No twitch of ear, no shift of paw. Just quiet. Too quiet. Caleb knelt beside him, pressing a calloused hand gently to the dog's side, still warm, but no rise, no breath, no beat. He stayed like that for a long time, hand resting on that old grizzled coat, as if waiting for it to stir under his touch, just once more. It didn't. And yet in that moment, Caleb didn't cry, didn't move. He just breathed, deep, heavy, grounded in something so full it couldn't even break. Shadow had gone the way all good soldiers hope to go, without fear, without pain. In peace, on post, still at his station, still close. The sun finally crested the ridge, light spilling over the trees, painting the porch gold. Caleb leaned down, forehead to fur. "Good job, brother," he whispered. "You can rest now." And the morning, that quiet, holy morning, held them both. The spade bit into the earth with a soft, reluctant thud. The ground beneath the old pine had thawed just enough for the work to begin, but each scoop felt heavier than the last, not because of the soil, but because of what it meant. Caleb dug in silence. No music, no prayers. Just the whisper of wind off the lake and the dull rhythm of grief carving its way downward. This was the spot. The pine's long arms bowed gently overhead, its roots stretched deep into the memory of seasons long past. It was where Shadow always paused on their walks, sniffing the wind, alert but calm. A quiet post for an old sentinel. Now it would be his last. The sun sat low behind a veil of clouds, soft and gray. Snow still clung to the lake's edge in patches, melting slow like sorrow that hadn't found its words yet. When the hole was finished, Caleb stepped away for a moment, catching his breath, hands trembling. Then he returned to the porch and lifted Shadow, wrapped carefully in the old green military blanket with the faded stitching along the edge. The same one that had traveled through too many wars and too many winters, the one that had kept them both warm when nothing else had. He carried him in both arms, steady but slow, down the path, past the cabin, through the clearing, and beneath the tree. Kneeling, Caleb laid him down as gently as he had lifted him. A hand pressed once more to that still shoulder, and for a moment time unraveled, all the years rewinding in a single heartbeat. From dust and gunfire in foreign lands to snowy porches and quiet nights beneath the stars. "You never left your post," Caleb whispered. His voice cracked, but he didn't wipe the tears. He let them fall. He reached for the small wooden marker he'd carved by hand the night before. It wasn't much, just a slab of pine, sanded smooth, words burned in with a hot nail, and a soldier's patience. Shadow, my hero, my brother, my friend. He pressed it into the soft earth at the head of the grave. The wind stirred the pine needles above them, a hush, a bow, a final salute. Caleb sat beside the mound long after the last handful of soil was patted down. He didn't speak. He just stayed. Because that's what you do for those who never walked away. For those who would have died 1,000 times. Just to keep you breathing. The light dimmed. The world moved on. But under that tree, time stood still. The screen door creaked open, then shut with a soft clack behind him. Caleb stepped back onto the porch, boots heavy with earth, his breath trailing like smoke in the late winter air. His hands were raw, fingernails edged with dirt, but he didn't brush them clean. The fire in the old iron stove still burned low, casting a circle of flickering warmth that glowed against the wood-paneled walls, and the handmade blanket tossed across the bench, the same one Shadow used to curl up on during stormy nights. Everything felt too quiet. The porch swing moved slightly, not from wind, but memory. Caleb didn't sit on it. He just stood there, watching the flames dance behind the iron grate, feeling their heat on a face that had weathered war and silence and loss. He looked to the spot where Shadow used to lie, the worn spot near the door where paw prints never quite faded, even after a rain. And then, quietly, with a voice barely louder than the wind, he said, "You didn't just save me." A breath. His throat tightened. "You gave me a reason to live." There was no audience, no ceremony, just those 8 words spoken into the dusk, not for the world, but for the one who'd already heard them without needing to. The pine trees rustled gently in the distance, and Caleb swore just for a second he heard the soft crunch of paws on snow. A familiar rhythm. Not real, maybe, but not imagined either. It was in the way the wind moved, the way the world listened. He turned his gaze toward the lake, toward the tree, toward the grave now cradled beneath a canopy of green and memory. The light had faded, but the fire held, and so did he. He stepped inside, letting the screen door sigh behind him. In the quiet cabin, he didn't reach for the lights. Just the old photo above the mantel, a black and white snapshot from years ago, Caleb in uniform, kneeling beside Shadow, both of them younger, leaner, sharper, alive in ways only the battlefield understands. He touched the edge of the frame. Outside, the wind kept moving through the pines, like a voice, like a presence, like something that refuses to be buried. Not really. Because some things don't leave, they remain. Morning came without meaning. The coffee brewed itself out of habit. Caleb didn't drink it. Just let it go cold on the windowsill as mist clung to the tree line outside, turning the world pale and hushed, like it was holding its breath. Days had begun to blur, not in grief's dramatic fashion, but in something quieter, numb, routine without rhythm, breaths counted only by the ticking of the old clock above the mantel. Shadow's collar still hung by the door. The tags clinked faintly when the wind moved through the cracks in the wood, like they were clearing their throat to speak, but never did. Caleb glanced at it every time he walked by, but never touched it. Not yet. Not until he was ready to feel how light it had become. The house wasn't just quiet now. It was silent. The kind of silence that had weight to it, that filled corners and pressed down on your chest. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something missing. The floorboards didn't creak anymore when Caleb moved across them, as if they, too, understood the need to tread softly. No paw scratches at the back door, no pacing when thunder rolled, no sighs as a heavy body curled by the fire, just empty bowls, a frayed leash, a porch ramp no longer needed, but never removed. Caleb stood at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around nothing. His gaze drifted to the window, to the woods beyond. He thought about the snow that would soon melt, the pine tree, the way wind still carried the scent of winter. "I thought I knew what loneliness was," he murmured, not to anyone in particular. "Turns out it has a face, and 4 legs." But he didn't cry, not anymore. Instead, he sat on the floor beside the spot where Shadow used to lie, and listened, not for footsteps, but for memory, because some presences don't leave all at once. Some stay, quiet, but never gone. It started with a knock, then another. By mid-morning, there were 3 cars parked outside and a path of soft boot prints tracked up the porch steps. Not frantic, not forced, just steady. Mrs. Halber from 2 lots down brought a pot of lilies. "He used to sniff them," she said, placing them on the windowsill. "Never bit, just sniffed, like he understood things were delicate." A pair of twin boys left a crayon drawing taped to the mailbox. A superhero dog with a vest and a tail like a cape. "We drew him flying," they explained, "because he's up there now." One old man left without saying a word, only resting a small wooden cross against the fence post before tipping his cap. And still, no one stayed too long, as if they all understood that grief isn't soothed by company, only honored by presence. Caleb stood on the porch most of the afternoon, nodding, thanking, gripping the railing when words wouldn't come. Shadow's collar remained untouched by the door, but now it seemed to gleam, not from polish, but from the glances cast its way. Reverent. Remembering. Near dusk, the mail truck eased up the road. A single envelope slid through the slot. No bills, no catalogs, just cream-colored cardstock embossed in silver. K9 Honor Foundation. Inside, a typed letter, formal but not cold. In recognition of Shadow's valor and lifelong service, we invite Caleb Merrick to speak at our annual commemoration. His story and Shadow's have reminded this nation of what loyalty truly means. Caleb read it once, then again, then held it in his lap for a long time. He didn't smile, but his shoulders shifted like something had lifted just a little. Out in the yard, wind stirred the pine needles, and for the first time in days, he whispered aloud, "They remembered you, brother." It came just after sunrise, a soft rapping, not urgent, but sure, the kind that waits rather than demands. Caleb opened the door, coffee still in hand, shadows still under his eyes. The porch creaked under the shifting weight of someone who'd stood in the cold for more than a few moments. She was wrapped in a wool coat, name badge faded at the corners, Breakwater Haven, Senior Care Unit. In her arms wriggled a shape barely contained, a blur of tan fur, oversized paws and ears too big for his head. "I'm sorry to come by unannounced," she said, brushing a snowflake from her collar. "We heard what Shadow did. And well, this little guy's been hard to place. Keeps escaping the pen to sit by the front gate, like he's waiting for someone." The pup squirmed, nose twitching at Caleb's flannel. A tail began to thump. Caleb didn't speak. He just looked, first at the woman's tired but kind eyes, then at the dog's. There was no polish to him, just gangly limbs, a clumsy stance, and a wide-eyed stare that didn't flinch when it met Caleb's. The pup reached forward, licked the back of his hand. And in that moment, brief, breath held, the world didn't shift, but it softened. Not a replacement, never that. But maybe a reminder that love doesn't return the same way twice. It finds new shapes, new names. The woman cleared her throat gently. "No pressure. We just thought maybe he's been waiting for the right porch." Caleb bent down slowly, letting the pup sniff the edge of his coat. One paw landed squarely on his boot, then another, wobbly, bold. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, then quietly, "What's his name?" The woman smiled. "Doesn't have one yet." "We figured he'd tell you." The porch groaned under familiar weight. Caleb stepped out into the morning light, flannel shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the air still carrying a bite of late winter. In his arms, the pup shifted. Not restless, just adjusting. His head tucked into the crook of Caleb's elbow, legs dangling, tail occasionally giving a curious flick. The sky was washed in soft gold, the lake below barely stirring. The pine tree stood still, not looming but present, like a sentinel that had seen it all and kept its silence. Caleb paused at the top step, boots rooted. He looked out, not at anything in particular, but as if expecting to see a familiar silhouette pacing the edge of the yard, ears alert, eyes old and kind. But there was only stillness, and the faint memory of paw prints, long since faded by snow and sun. He adjusted the pup in his arms. "You see that tree?" he said softly, nodding toward the pine. "That's where heroes rest." The pup blinked up at him, ears too big for his head, tail wagging like it hadn't learned rhythm yet. Caleb smiled, the kind of smile that aches gently in the corners of your eyes. "Shadows watching," he whispered, voice nearly lost to the wind. He paused, then added with a dry chuckle, "Don't mess it up, kid." He stepped down slowly, the pup's paw brushing against the badge still clipped to Caleb's belt. One life carrying another. One chapter gently handing the next its first page. Somewhere in the distance a raven called once. The pine branches stirred, not loud, just enough, and from the porch it no longer felt like silence, just waiting. The trail hadn't changed. Still narrow, still soft with pine needles, still flanked by tall sentinels that filtered sunlight into ribbons. But it felt different now, not because the woods had changed, but because the silence wasn't lonely anymore. Caleb walked slow, hands in his coat pockets, letting the new pup wander a few feet ahead. The little guy tripped on a root, then shook it off with a sneeze and bolted forward again, tail wagging like a faulty compass. His oversized paws made more noise than necessary, crashing through leaves and puddles, but he didn't seem to mind. Everything was new. Everything was worth investigating. The old footpath had been Shadow's domain once, every twist and stone etched into memory. Caleb had walked it alone since, boots dragging, steps heavy. But today, something shifted. He paused near a bend, the same spot where Shadow used to wait if Caleb ever lagged behind. The pup spun in a half-circle, tongue lolling, ears cocked at uneven angles. Then he darted off, chasing something invisible and joyous. Caleb laughed. It burst out of him unplanned, rough at first like a cough, then fuller. A laugh that felt rusty, like it had been buried under winters too long. It echoed through the trees and startled a few birds into flight. The pup looked back, eyes wide. Caleb knelt, patting his thigh. "Come on, rookie," he said with a grin. "We've got miles to go." The pup came bounding, full speed, tripping again but catching himself mid-slide. And just like that, step by clumsy step, the trail that once marked sorrow became something else entirely. The beginning of a new journey. The afternoon sun slanted low, casting long shadows over the lake. The breeze had turned cooler, the kind that carried the first scent of autumn even though summer hadn't quite let go. Caleb walked the trail alone this time. The pup was home, curled up by the hearth, tired after another day of bounding through grass and chewing everything in reach. But Caleb had somewhere else to be, a place where time seemed to pause. He reached the pine near the water's edge, where the roots curled like old hands into the earth. The wooden marker stood exactly where he left it, its carving still strong. Shadow, my hero, my brother, my friend. He knelt slowly, brushing away the needles that had gathered near the base. His fingers paused on the smooth grain of the marker, tracing the name once more. Then he rested his palm flat against it. For a long moment he said nothing. Only the quiet hum of wind through branches, the hush of water lapping at the shore. Then a sound, not loud, not sudden, just the faint rustle of leaves overhead, as if something unseen had passed through. Caleb looked up. The boughs swayed gently, light shifting in broken patterns across the ground. And in that stillness, in that breath between heartbeats, he didn't feel alone. He could almost hear it. Not words, not voice, but something deeper. A knowing, a warmth, a presence. His lips moved just above a whisper. "Miss you, boy." A pause, then a voiceover, quiet, steady, filled with memory and peace, rises over the scene like a final note held in soft air. Love never truly leaves. It just finds a new way to return. The screen fades to the lake, then to the sky, then to black. In a world that often moves too fast, the quiet loyalty of a dog can remind us of what truly matters: presence, love, and the kind of devotion that asks for nothing in return. Through Caleb and Shadow's story, we're reminded that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures, but in the slow, steady rhythm of shared days and silent understanding. German shepherds, intelligent, steadfast, and brave, are more than working dogs. They are companions, protectors, and often the reason someone keeps going. Shadow was all of that and more. He wasn't just a hero in uniform. He was a mirror to Caleb's soul, a quiet anchor in the storm. This story is a tribute to every animal that stands by us, through trauma, through joy, through goodbye. It's a reminder that love leaves its mark, even after the paw prints fade. May we all learn to love as unconditionally, to listen more, to walk together, even when the path is hard, and to open our hearts when life offers a second chance, even if it arrives in the form of a clumsy pup with two big paws and eyes full of wonder, because sometimes love returns, just in a different shape.